Very good to see you, David.
Very good to see you too. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's, well, it's a good question,
How is everybody doing? Yeah.
Yeah. Like our lives have been turned around 180 degrees, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
It's been actually maybe it's a good thing. I mean, it's not a good thing, obviously. It's not a good thing to have a pandemic and everyone being ill, but actually it's fascinating, isn't it, when you actually press stop on everything?
Yeah.
And some of it's terrible, and some of it you think, oh, actually it's fascinating because you normally you carry on tomorrow doing the same thing because you can, or you so yeah, it's been interesting. It's like everybody else. I'm keen to get back to doing some of what we were doing before.
You see, like, I think part of the question really is it really a stop on everything? I don't think that's the case. It's the world where people meet up that has been stopped.
No, and it's been a start on some things. I mean, I've done funny, you've had all the people, you've had the people doing strange things in lockdown. Robert and Toya, have created an alternative world in lockdown.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, we did music for quiet moments, which I don't think we would have done. I don't know if you followed those. We've been putting up a soundscape every week, a contemplative piece, because that felt appropriate. I've started playing bridge with my father every weekend, and it's wonderful, actually. I've seen more, in a funny way, I spent more time with my father this year, not physically, obviously, but than ever before.
Yeah.
We could always have done it, but none of us can go anywhere. We all get together online and on the weekend. So it's been. I assumed it would be a wonderful creative space, and that's the only thing it hasn't been. I assumed that because the world was pausing, I'm trying to write another album, a book, and hey, we're going to have time to do these things. And actually, if anything, there seems to be more. You have to work harder to achieve less, I think is
yes.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for me, the first maybe 6 months were maybe still kind of like okay creatively, because it was the summer, right? And there was some good energy there somehow, and the first attempts at trying something different and something new, and it was exciting. But then as the winter came, things really started to become very repetitive, and it became apparent that like an alternative path may not be sustainable for a very long time, and like a year now almost kind of like feels it's a very long time, so. And I just wrote in a private group on Facebook today. I wrote that I'm actually well, I didn't really say that my career is over, but it really the fact that I'm forced to be doing something completely different is kind of like puts me on a different path, and I really don't know if how I can return, especially when it comes to feeding my family, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and so it's really very, very, very complex situation. And I remember the last time I saw you very, very briefly was 1.5 years ago in Berlin at the King Crimson show, and you walked past, and I think it was the first time I saw you with the beard. It
was still there this morning. It comes and goes, my beard, it lasts until my wife suggests that I should lose it.
Hey, so I had you on my list of people I wanted to talk to anyway, but then last week, actually on April 1st, you made a.
I realized how suitable April 1st.
Was that intentional?
No, it was. If you mean the blog post, it was written absolutely simply because I played the Prelude #1. I mean, that's the only thing I have achieved in lockdown actually is that I have found time to go and play the piano.
Mm-hmm.
And which is I don't know how many people listening are musicians, but anyway, it's astonishing. You put up, I don't know, the first part of Moonlight Sonata or something, and then there you are communing with Beethoven, and you start by thinking, well, there's all the bits you know, and you get into the subtlety of it and the changes, and it's astonishing. So I've been working my way through various pieces. I've done some Satie pieces, some Beethoven pieces, and I was thinking, well, what should I play next? And I'm not quite sure how I lighted on it actually, but I was going to, oh, Prelude number 1 would be interesting to play. And I'm an atrocious sight reader. I would think normally I would regard myself as an atrocious sight reader. And I sat down and pretty much played it faultlessly off the page the first time through. Because your fingers can't help but play it. Mm-hmm. It's music that already exists somehow. The only way I can explain it, it's faultless, it exists. I explained this to my daughter, who said, well, perhaps you wrote it in an alternative life or a previous life. And I said, well, no, I don't think I was Bach in an alternative life, but it's just one of those inevitably beautiful pieces of music. How could it not exist? And it was really, it struck me after I played it. For whatever reason, I thought it is when you are physically playing a piece of music like that, the notion of ownership of music, it doesn't seem wrong. It just seems absurd or pointless or irrelevant. Hence the blog post. Because obviously,
yes. It's a very interesting, because on one level, I obviously totally agree with you, but then also it's sort of like it's a fact that there is like one person or a group of people that bring pieces of art into this world. And even though it may already be there somewhere, it gets, I don't know, it gets transcribed in some way, right? And that's kind of the part where the ownership then has been assigned.
It wasn't. I think that I haven't really continued to think of it greatly. I was going to take this opportunity talking to you to sort of delve more into what it might mean, because it's not. It's the terminology that's difficult. Obviously, as I wrote in the blog, I think I'm not in any way trying to, demean Bach's genius by saying he didn't write it. How the process of writing happens is actually slightly outside of this, whether people write the music or the music writes the person. But there are, peculiar people of whom there are a limited number, I suppose, if you really go to the people who've written the core catalogue that we know and love. Mm-hmm. It's I don't know, maybe 100, but it's not as many as you'd think it would be, I suppose. But so there are people who are transcendent and can tune into music, and music flows out of them, and there it is. And I'm not trying to say that their names shouldn't be at the bottom of the piece of paper, nor in fact that they don't deserve to be hugely wealthy, because what they're doing, is enormous. So I'm not saying they shouldn't be able to make a living. I'm not saying their name should not have been on it. In fact, it's not that at all. It's partly when you sit in the world that I half sit in and wish I didn't, which is the corporate world. That's when the word ownership can become complicated. So it's not that Bach didn't write it, or that it should be attributed to him, or that we shouldn't revere him for so doing. And in the case of Bach, it's now fine actually, because it's long enough ago that his pieces of music don't exist in the corporate jungle. But there is a danger that this notion of ownership, as in a corporation, particularly when it's a corporation rather than a person, I think, a third of the music made by the world now is pretty much owned by a part of Universal. When they own it, because there's a tendency that it gets frozen in time. I think that's the danger, because I think partly, when you play Bach, the opening chords are C major, D minor, G major, or G7 back to C. There you go. Those are the opening three. And I'm sure he wasn't the first person who'd ever put those three chords together. And so all of us are building. Everybody is building on a building block that already exists. That's what we all do. I mean, I think in my core, I would regard myself as a songwriter. And if you're a serious songwriter, well, at some point or other, you know, I dissected, you know, how does McCartney write songs? How does Lennon write songs? How did Paul Simon write songs? And you don't then set out to plagiarize them, but actually there are probably 10 songwriters who I sort of assimilated their DNA because I love what they write and I know how they write it.
Mhm.
You know, and hopefully I will write something that's me, but I'd be stupid if I denied I'm not building on building blocks that existed. I'm not, you know, and often when you hit a chord, you know where you've heard it before. So I think music is a living, breathing thing that moves forward. And there's a danger that you get into this where you can't do that. You know, those three chords are this. They're owned by that.
Mhm.
If you took that really, really seriously, it'd be almost impossible to write a piece of music, because actually most things, when you hear them, you think, oh, it's a little bit like this, or it's a little bit like this. And when is something a little bit like this, and when is it a lot like this? And when so I think fundamentally there's an issue with that, and that there's a bit of me that thinks that music should be free.
Mhm.
I say this as a person who makes a living out of selling music. That in its essence, music is like the air. You know, for people who love music, it's like the air we breathe, isn't it? So I mean, music is part of the world. So I think it's right that people should be able to earn a living. And I said it was particularly when I struck that piece. I played that piece of music, and I thought the notion of somebody should own this is very odd to me. Does that move us a step forward?
It does. I think it's kind of the model of patronage kind of like is returning and has always been around in the arts. And I wonder in the times of Bach what his situation was like. You know, people probably didn't pay him for each individual piece, but there were people that knew of his genius and supported him so that he could write those pieces. And
Yes.
I mean, and the music is free, right? The music's still kind of in that.
In those days, I wrote in history, I suspect the music was free and the musician was paid, was the way it used to work. I'm not saying that's a better model, but I imagine that's where it was. So I think, you know, Bach would have been paid to write a piece of music for church this Sunday, which he wrote and played, and the score would have existed. I don't know that he would have been paid again if somebody else then took that score and played it again the following week somewhere else in the same way. You know, I don't know if that would have happened. But so no, I think there was a patronage model, which is one of the models which sort of the internet has actually already partly converged back with, because I know with new artists, it's very difficult to support yourself, you know, selling music on the old model. And I think when you go to some of these Kickstarter things and those types of things, a lot of people actually are willing to put up money that isn't really buying something. They're putting up money to support something that they would like to exist. They're effectively supporting something. So I mean, patronage remains a model. I'm not averse to selling stuff. I mean, I suppose the core part of DGM these days is actually selling beautiful things. And actually, I think when you have that, that's a slightly different issue. But because I realize I put behind me for you, there you are, especially for you, I sat here. This is where I sat when I played it, and there is Prelude number 1. That's half. That's the free half. Sitting here, we can't see it actually. Sitting there is the King box set. There's the other half of it. There's the argument sitting behind me. So and I think if you make beautiful things and people want to buy them, that remains perfectly valid. I think the King Crimson is in a very lucky part of the market in that it has fans who would like to buy beautiful things and therefore support it. So the real dilemma about all of this is impacting with younger musicians and starting musicians, because if if Spotify is the future, yeah, you used to be able to make a living, probably, in fact, out of selling 1,000, 10,000 CDs. You could have made a living. Now, so let's assume that's 10,000 people, and they listen to your music on Spotify. You can barely buy a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
So there is a huge dilemma coming up about how that works, and therefore how the musician gets paid, and there are lots of well-meaning steps that get taken, and all they seem to do is go back in a circle, back into the same corporate mess. I'm going off a tangent here. Drag me back to the middle, by the way, if I wander off. But anyway, so for example, when they lengthened copyright recently for the record label, so copyright was going to end after 50 years, and they extended, I think, to 70 years now. And part of the deal was that in the extension, if you've got a record that's over 50 years old, you now have to give some money to PRS or PPL, one or the other, who gives it to the session musicians who played on the sessions. So effectively, some of the money now will go to the session musicians who played on things, and that's well-meaning and right. That if we're going to carry on making money out of recording, it's perfectly right that people who played on it should get paid. Except that in practice, it will almost certainly fail because nobody knows who they were. And actually, and having tried it with Robert, when we were trying to prove that Robert played on records, if I can't prove that Robert Fripp played on a record, if I happen to be the third trombone player playing on a Beatles record, who is going to believe me? Bluntly. So because I know the first thing that happens when you do any of these things with these organizations is they say, prove it. Well, because it wasn't a thing at the time, how many people really know and can prove 50 years ago that they played on a session? I mean, even the major players, I talked to John Paul Jones about this, Mel Collins about this. They don't even remember what they played on. Mm-hmm. John Paul Jones will tell you, when he was a bass player for hire, he'd play on about 2 or 3 records a day. He'd be doing one, and there'd be a cab waiting outside the studio for him to take his bass out of the studio, hop in the cab, go on to the next one to play on another thing, mm-hmm. and likewise. So, and these guys were the major players. Yeah. So if nobody's sure what they played on, so ironically, what all this does, which is I think my problem with ownership in a funny way, is most of this money doesn't percolate back to the people who needed it, i.e. the musicians. What actually happens is money gets collected by PRS and PPL. This fund gets collected, and it doesn't get distributed to the right people because nobody knows who they were.
Yeah.
So it hasn't solved. Well, if we look forward to you, I don't know, if we went forward and you've been a gigging player and you played on things, it might work going forward. So in 50 years' time, because people might now be thinking, oh, we need to keep a record of this. But when they do these things retrospectively, which is exactly what happened with the Robert Fripp thing about him playing on Heroes, mm-hmm. They much later than that, they created the featured players criteria on a record, that if you're featured on a record, you get some money. And by any modern criteria, given what David Bowie himself said, what Brian Eno has said in writing, what Tony Visconti has said in writing, by any of those criteria, Robert would be what is now deemed to be a featured player. But it didn't say so on the record because at the time nobody used the word because position didn't exist. Mm-hmm. And so if you take our position, which is we've been trying to solve that problem, and you can't. They basically say, and you think, well, why did you bother to backdate it? So you backdated it. You backdated this thing to cover featured players at the time. Robert would have been a featured player. Ironically, if you're the singer, they will accept it. So if you're the singer on the record, they will say, oh, you can say, oh, I was the singer. They'll say, okay, you count as a featured player. But if you happen to be an instrumentalist whose iconic voice is a guitar, for example, not a voice, they won't accept it. And I'm not saying it's, I think it is wrong, but it's just another example of the fact they create these criteria And in fact, all that really happens is they're cycling music money back into a black box that disappears in what we'll call the music industry.
You know, like I have an idea, or I would even say like a theory about what is kind of like the underlying problem, but maybe also the underlying beautiful thing about this problem. It's that people who are creative and in the most real way, like you create materials that contribute to the world, right? You create things that other people consume.
Yep.
Right? You actually you feel some sort of responsibility for your own world. So you're kind of creating that fantasy world around yourself. So that also means that, say, the beings on the other end that have a different job in this world, they sort of like have a certain kind of power over the others, because they know that the artist is happy anyway. The artist is happy with a little bit of money. Like we keep the rest, right? And it's true, because like the musician is self-contained, right? Ideally, let's say, like, and happy because you have something that you can contribute to the world. You have the tools to build that pink castle around you, right? Like, in a way. And I think that's a contributing factor to why things have come the way they've come. And we all know the example of like the first recorded voice, where, I don't know, a lady or a guy, got paid $10, and then they made like 50,000 copies of it, right? So I don't know, but and that's the beginning. That's the beginning of that. And you know so much about this. I'm actually a little bit surprised, to be honest, and I mean this in the best possible way, that even after 30 years of dealing with this absurdity, you sort of like, it's still something that touches you so deeply,
Well, I suppose my entire life is split, and I live that absurdity on a daily basis. I had because the half of my life, fortunately, is musical, and you're right that musicians create music. They have to create music. In fact, you can't stop them creating music. Robert Ory, I think, often refers to it being a bit slightly like a mother who has to give birth. A musician has to create, a true musician has to create music. Yeah. So, and there is a reward and a wonderfulness for doing it, and it is its own reward, provided it has an audience. I think it's probably heartbreaking to create music without an audience, but a musician who has an audience is in a sense satisfied. And that's wonderful, and that's the happy part of the world. And the other half of my world is dealing with what it means to bring that into the world, both from our perspective, which is relatively benign, in fact, but also where it crosses over into relationships with the mega music corporations. Yeah. So and 2/3 of that model now is quite happy. I mean, I'm very fortunate in the musicians I work with. We have found a way of placing our music into the world where everyone is rewarded handsomely for what they do, which now I think works very well. So when that's happening, you think, oh, this is a happy model. And then, once every 6 months or whatever, you hit the snag that is the mainstream music industry, which really is an industry. And it's not my job, I suppose, to belittle it for being that. It is just different. In other words, the music business is business. It's business exploiting music. That is what it is. And I suspect the people working on the higher echelons of it know that's what they do. They're not They are simply in the business of music, and the way they make money is by monetizing music in the same way that somebody who's got a lot of coal. Well, what I do is I get maximum bucks for my coal and at minimum cost. And to some extent, I think the music industry does that. We get maximum bucks for our music at minimum cost, and the minimum cost means keeping those musicians happy by paying them just enough that they'll carry on doing what they do without bothering us too much, I think. And yes, and there is an inherent disconnect there, and you're right. It still bothers me.Es, it does still bother me.
Yeah, but you see, in a way, what you're saying is, or one conclusion could be that if you have no contact with the music business, you are much better off as a musician, even financially.
Oh,
and I would say that is the case for me, right? And there's like something like I have to say thank you to you and Robert for starting DGM back then, and sort of like setting an example for how things can be, and Robert like insisting that I should not go study music at conservatory and stuff. So it was all great, and I think it's still the first record deal I had with my friend Ian Boddy was we'll split 50-50. That's the deal, the handshake, and it's still good till this day, and it's wonderful. So I'm grateful that I never had any kind of mainstream success. It somehow enables me to communicate differently with people and to actually see the fans as friends, and it's really a different world if you've never really been in touch with the old model, let's say.
The old model can have value, and I used to think that perhaps I still think really that the music industry is probably undervalued, ironically, and it's undervalued because it sees itself wrongly. Mm-hmm. So I can remember being utterly surprised, it was in the early 2000s when Microsoft was trying desperately hard to do a deal with EMI to move their streaming platform forward. And somebody at one of the meetings mentioned the market cap of EMI at the time, which was tiny. The value of EMI was tiny. And the person at Microsoft said, well, why instead of having conversations with them, why don't we just buy them? Because this company is not worth anything relatively compared to us. And it's still true, I think, if you looked at, whatever prices, in fact, it's being sold this year, I think it's on there, but whatever price is put on Universal, I suspect would still in a sense seem very low, mm-hmm. despite the fact it owns a third of the music ever recorded. Mm-hmm. And I think the reason for that is that they see their value wrongly. They think their value is what they own. They are obsessed. It comes back to the absurdity of ownership. They think that their value of Universal is in the music they own, and they own it, and we will exploit it. They want to own it for that reason. And in fact, I think the value of Universal, I personally would contend, is really that of an advertising agency, who actually doesn't necessarily own anything at all, if you want to look at it that way. And if I was talking to you about, should you do a deal with the devil, as in, if you're a young musician, should you go off to Universal Music and sign on the dotted line? There is only one reason why I think you would do it, and that's if you believe that the advertising agency is worth the price. In other words, if you believe that Universal is going to help you to a larger market and you want that market. Mm-hmm. You won't necessarily be richer for doing it unless you become a megastar. You won't be richer for doing it. But if you believe, that there is something those labels can do that very rarely happens outside of them, when they take people from a sort of local or medium-sized success to a much larger success, and which is really nothing to do with ownership. And I'd say it's entirely to do with really marketing clout. Marketing, and I don't mean marketing necessarily as adverts, but just simply in being able to put your face in the right places and get you the right contact. So they do have a value, if that's what you want. And if that isn't what you want, or if you
but David, can the company as such actually deliver that? I don't think so. It's got to be the people that work for the company that have the relationship with the artist and sympathize with the artist.
But I'm taking the company as a whole as a thing. You're right. It is the people. We can get onto that in a minute.
Yeah.
If you are for any other reason, if you're a musician, you should keep away from the music industry. Yeah. I mean, the advice you were given remains, I think, sound. But in fact, if you're going to sell reasonably small numbers of records, there's far more money to be made by doing it yourself. For a start, you connect with your fans differently by doing it yourself. Your music can possibly be more true by doing it yourself, because there's no constraints placed upon you about where you should go. If the next album you want to make is nothing like the previous one you made, well, there you are. You're free to do it. You have the musical freedom to do it. So there are a lot of reasons why it's good to sit outside it. In fact, the early model of King Crimson probably is one of the best examples of coexistence. In fact, because of course, they were it was them and their two managers were King Crimson EG. That was it. It was a shared split between them and their managers, and they then licensed the album to two larger labels, Island and Atlantic, which were then not as large as anything that's around now. But they were those labels who then took it into the world. So there are ways of dealing with this monster, but yes, going off and signing your soul to a major label remains probably a problem. And coming back to your thing about people, the other problem is, you're quite right, that it remains, it's a tangible relationship. And the number of stories you hear about people who were signed to a label by somebody who liked them and understood that music, and then that somebody leaves, and now the person remains signed and owned by this label, but now has no interest in them at all, and nobody there understands who they are and what they are. It's and you're owned, and yes, and if you signed on the dotted line, they now own your music. Da-dum, da-dum, back to where we started. Yes. But yeah.
So which alternative is there, like, to ownership, to the idea of ownership?
Well, I don't know. I'm not yet signed up. I know there's been various free music things, and I think we do sit in a world of ownership, and when it's at the artist level, I think it works fine. Because when it's at the artist level, it's really not that different to me saying, well, of course, the piece of music sitting beside me should say it was written by Bach, and he should get the credit for writing it. And if there's any money to be had for it being played due to the composer, he should have it. I'm not in any way trying to demean Bach. And so if you took, well, actually, they didn't ask about the second album, but I was asked the other day about the first Europa String Choir album, because they want to add it to Bandcamp, I think.
Yeah.
And Udo wrote to ask and said, well, can we do this? And is there a problem? What's the situation with this music? And it's very simple. I said, well, actually, you own it, Udo. You own it. You're the artist. You own it. So if you want to put it on Bandcamp, you should go and put it on Bandcamp. And I think nominally I would have earned, because I produced it, would have earned a bit of money, and I think Robert would have earned a bit of money, both of which we were very happy to let go at present, as I doubt Bandcamp is going to be paying fortunes. But at the simple level, it works very well. They own that music. And even if we get into where I started this from, the notion of infringement and people building on music written by other people, I think artists have a fairly accurate sense of what's fair. So if you've written a piece of music and I don't know, some other CD comes out, I think artists tend to know whether what they're listening to is a development from their music, is a perfectly fair musical development moving forward, and effectively another bricklayer being laid on top of what they did, as opposed to, hold on, that note for note is the piece that I wrote, and that's they've simply taken this score written by Bach and written their name, crossed my name out and written their name on the top, and that's an infringement. So I think that when it's at an artist level, in a funny way, ownership works perfectly well as an idea. It's really when it becomes, mega corporations, and mega corporations come with gazillions of contracts, and they come with lots and lots of lawyers, and those layers by their nature are not musical.
Yep. So
the lawyer that is now discussing whether or not this piece of music written by Marcus Reuter is is an infringement or not, or what we should do with it. He may have joined that because he loved music. I'm not demeaning the lawyers, but in the end, their job is to be a lawyer. They're not a musician who happens to own something. Their job is to be a lawyer, and more than that, their job is to maximize the profits for the corporation they work for. So it doesn't even come down necessarily to a question of what's fair, as in, do you really think this piece of music was developed? Actually, it comes down to, do I think I can get away with it? And legally, do I think I can do this? Mm-hmm. Which isn't the same as, is it morally right to do it? And I'm, in a way, I'm not trying to be hypercritical of that situation. It's just a different, you've imposed a set of rules that would apply perfectly well, in all the other facets of industry. It's exactly the same system, but when applied to music, it does, then you do end up in some oddities, I think.
So may I ask you, other actual examples in your life as a music manager, like a current situation where there's a question about ownership that you could?
I mean, we are. There probably isn't a moment when we're not in dispute with somebody. I probably shouldn't tell you the latest one, but yes, we're always in dispute with somebody.
It would be good to just have like one example, just to see what.
I mean, because people use things. I mean, if you go back, which is a slightly live issue. I mean, you've got when 21st Century Schizoman cropped up on Power by Kanye West. Without us being asked. I assume do you know the history of this? I mean, so it's now happened in 2010, I think now. But there was this new piece by Kanye released on YouTube. There was his new song Power, which has the chorus 21st Century Schizoman by King Crimson in it. Mm-hmm. And we had never been asked, we had never been told, we knew nothing about it. Mm-hmm. And that's when, to me, ownership is perfectly appropriate, because if Kanye and his record label are planning to make money out of this, which they undoubtedly are, then it's right and proper that King Crimson should get their fair share of it. Mm-hmm. And so we met with Kanye. We met with their lawyers. Their lawyers came over and originally said, well, it's a minor piece. We'll give you a couple of 10 cents here or $10,000 here or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I think we told them, we said, well, there is a precedent for people using samples without permission, which is, I think, Unfinished Symphony by the with the Rolling Stones. And the precedent is, we'll take it all. Perhaps you'd like to go out of the room and come back and be nice to us instead of trying to be so thoughtful. They then said, we'll take the sample out. That was their next step. And we pointed out, well, you'll have two problems then. The first problem is that you've already released it, so we'll still sue you because you can't unrelease it. It's been, you put it on YouTube already, you released it. And secondly, even if you released a subsequent version that didn't have our sample in, we would sue you over the publishing, because you can tell that the cadence of the verse is deliberately intended to arrive at our thing at the end. So if you remove it, we are still part of the writing of that track, because you can hear it was intended to go da-da-dum, 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 21st Century Schizoman. So good luck removing it. And eventually, we came to an agreement. I said, oddly enough, we are revisiting whether or not they've honourably obeyed the terms of the sample license we gave them. But that's that's an example where, you know, there's, if you're playing the game of ownership, which those corporations are, if you're playing the game of ownership, fine, it's right and proper that King Crimson should get their share. And those, the sampling world seems to be remarkably happy. I think stupidly happy, if I'm honest, but to simply go ahead, steal it and worry about it later.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you were managing Kanye, you would have thought it'd been far more intelligence to ask us before you released it, or even before you'd done it, actually. Because if you'd come to us and said, you know, well, we're thinking of doing this, we might have been quite keen and quite nice, and you know, to say, well, yes, we'd quite like to get it used. In other words, the boot would be slightly on the other foot. In other words, we would be keen to be involved, as opposed to them. Whereas once they've gone and done it, actually they have no bargaining power whatsoever, which is bizarre. So in fact, they're entirely beholden on how nice do we feel. Mm-hmm. When it comes to splitting up this track, it comes down to how nice do we feel. And in fact, fortunately, I think we have a very good sense of what is fair, and we were very, you know, there were other samples involved, and we were very keen that we weren't seen to take more than Kanye. So I think they did very well out of us. But there have been a couple of cases recently. There was a, I think there was a Flippinino track. There have been 2 or 3 cases recently where after they've been released, we found, you know, somebody's taken something, sampled it, not asked us about it. Mm-hmm. And part of that almost seems to come down to common courtesy. You think, well, we're undoubtedly more aggressive and more offended when we find out about them like that than we would be if people ask.
Sure. You know, like I think it's interesting that, you know, because like every contract you sign in the music business very clearly states that you can only, you know, if you claim that something is yours, it has to be yours. And if it's not, then it's the fault of the artist.
Yes.
So it's kind of interesting, because in a way the record companies sort of like give the blame to the artist. So really they don't even need to police what is in the music. They don't even need to know.
Sadly, I suspect they will have blamed either Kanye or the producers, I'm sure, for not telling them, you know, that there were samples that needed to be cleared. I imagine is what they will have done.
Yeah.
Whether that's actually what happened, I think Kanye maintained that in fact the record label had decided that it was slightly cool to release this surreptitiously early before anything had been done. I don't know the story, but you're right. I think the artist is always required to, you know, or either the artist or the producer to commit to the fact that there are no uncleared samples. But it's remarkably common when. I think it was in the course of Crimson King that cropped up recently on one. That goes on, and it grates. It grates, and it's sort of an annoyance, because it would be almost nothing to do with ownership. It would seem like common decency to ask. You know, if Bach was alive and I wanted to use a bit of this, you know, you could write, you know, dear. Do you mind? I've written a melody on top of your piece here. Do you mind if I use it, please? Yeah.
Hey, so David, how did you get into all of this?
All of this. I've always done all of this. This is all I've ever done. I got into production because I refused to practice as a musician. Mm-hmm. Well, no, I became a conductor, not a particularly good conductor. So to begin with, I was, you know, I played instruments, and I think I played a lot of instruments for a year. I played the cello for a year and the French horn for a bit more than that. And I played the flute for a short while. I played a lot of instruments, and I was really quite interested in how they worked, as in getting to understand the instrument. And then when it got into the bit that you're probably good at, and that, you know, real musicians are good at, I'm now going to practice it until I can play it properly, I really wasn't interested. I like to understand the instruments enough that I could write for them and compose for them, and then I really couldn't be bothered. And they gave up on me eventually. They said, well, obviously you should be the conductor, because you're because you're reasonably musical, you know all these instruments, but you refuse to play any of them very well. So I became a conductor. And when you move into, you know, popular music, you're not a conductor anymore. You're a record producer. So so I think that's probably how I got into producing. And that really is, well, that and writing. I'm probably most passionate about songwriting, but that's all I've ever done. And I was, Robert's always maintained that it was inevitable, probably, that we would start working together, as he flatters me by saying that I was probably the best of my ilk kicking around in, you know, southern England at the time, and he was certainly one of the prime musicians. So probably it was inevitable that at some point or other we were going to meet and think that perhaps we'd like to work together. And I met Robert in 1989, and we got on, and I've worked on virtually everything he's done ever since.
Mm-hmm. So the first record was Sunday All Over the World, or?
Well, so I actually first started on a Guitarcraft tour. So I was actually producing a record in Tony Arnold's studio in Cranbourne, and Robert phoned Tony, because he'd been working with him, saying he just fired his sound engineer halfway through a tour, and did he know anyone who could come in at short notice to do front of house for the Guitarcraft. Mm-hmm. And Tony I remember turning around and saying to me, Dave, what are you doing in 2 weeks' time? And I said, well, I'm free. And he said, well, do you fancy doing that then? So I said, yes. And I met with Robert, and then flew out to Seattle and did the Guitarcraft tour. I have some very, very strange scores that one day I will have to show Bert or somebody, because all I had was, on the way out, I was given a DAT tape of the set. Mm-hmm. And I hear time signatures fairly different to a lot of Guitarcraft people. You know, I don't hear bars of 13. I probably hear a pulse, as in I'll hear, you know, a 4, a 3, or whatever. So I wrote the time, but I scored the set, and of course the set was continuous, so I didn't even know where the pieces. I'm not even sure I had the pieces beginning and ending in the right places, you know. But I mugged myself up a rough score. Okay, the music's roughly like this. This is roughly what it's going to be. And I then did the first show, and John Sinks, now sadly not with us, was beside me. Of course, knew the set inside out. And I can remember thinking, why is he not mixing this? He was sort of the assistant, you know. He set everything up. It was obviously just John didn't have the whatever to say he could have done it, because I'm sure he could have done. But anyway, I can remember sitting there. He knows all this really well. Why am I mixing this, not him? Thrack was the interesting one, the version that the Guitarcraft used to play, because halfway through that there was a big moment when you had to throw the reverb in, that big reverb moment. Mm-hmm. And you know, I duly banged it in on time. John looked and said, "That's amazing. You've been counting all the 7s and 5s, and you know, worked out that it arrives there." And I said, "Well, no, I haven't actually. I know the rhythm goes bash, you know." And I'd actually scored this entirely without a 7 and a 5 going on against each other. So, which I repeated later on, exactly the same thing with Baboom, with Bill Bruford. I edited that for him on Thrack. Mm-hmm. The same thing is true. He said, "Oh, the original version as they played it was slightly too long." He said, "David, we need to lose a bit of this." And I did an edit and said, "Oh, well, okay, we're going to go from there to there, chop that bit out." Mm-hmm. And he looked and said, "That's perfect, David. You found the exact point where the cycles are." And I said, "Well, actually, the same thing. I just sort of, because it's the same thing. There were 2 cycles going on." And I said, "No, but actually both times I was right for an obvious reason, but I'd heard it wrongly. As in, I had heard the 2 making a hybrid rhythm. And I said, well, hold on, you've got this rhythm going here and that rhythm going there. But I didn't have it as a rhythm of one type signature against another. I'm an ordinary musician, so I don't cope with things like that. I just have one time signature, and I knew how it worked, you know. So anyway, I did the Guitarcraft Court tour with Robert, came back to England, and they'd fallen out with Tony Arnold halfway through recording the album. He and Toyah really didn't see eye to eye. So although they recorded the backing tracks, they needed the vocals recording, and so I recorded them. Very strange. Tony Arnold's studio really didn't work without him because nothing worked. You needed him to pick things to make it work, but he wasn't allowed in the building when I was engineering. So Toyah came in and I recorded the vocals, and you know, if something went wrong, Toyah had to go and make herself absent and we had to get Tony back in again to kick whatever needed kicking to make it work, and then we carried on again. So we did that when really I was just an engineer for hire. But we got on well, it worked well. So I then compiled Frame by Frame, then did The Great Deceiver, and we set forth until when my third child was about to be born. I was living in France at the time. My wife will tell me I was living in France going to work on an aeroplane, which doesn't make wives happy. I think that would probably be the way. And so when my third child was going to be born, she said, David, you need to find a job when you come home at night. Rather than swanning off and having great fun producing music, you know, anywhere else. And Robert had talked about forming a record label. So I phoned him up and said, if you're serious about forming this record label, I'll come to England and we'll put a label together. And that was 1993, which is when we started DGM. I suspect Robert might have seen what followed. I didn't. That's because I'm blind, and I'm willfully blind, maybe. As in, you know, Robert might have guessed that we would still be doing it now had you asked him in 1993. Had you asked me in 1993, I didn't realize that I was jumping into a long haul adventure. It was just the obvious step. But ever since, actually, you know, it's remained the obvious step, so that's fine.
Yeah, you just mentioned the Great Deceiver box set, which has been super influential on me somehow, not just because of the music, but because of the presentation, like the idea to take old recordings and to restore them, and that was actually those were all multi-tracks, I think, right?
Yes, so that was in the same days when, yes, we were using multi-tracks, and I talk about the studio that doesn't work. I can tell you that the Great Deceiver, when we first got that, we put up, I think, the tapes for the first CD, which was Providence, and there was no bass drum. The bass drum track one was silent, and so we thought, what do I do? And it was in the days of very early computer software. And so I tweaked all the other existing drum things so that you could vaguely hear a bass drum and use that to trigger a bass drum effectively. So I triggered a bass drum all the way through and made a bass drum trigger and thought, okay, now I've got a big bass drum. Took days because Bill doesn't play a sort of sensible bass drum. We've got tiny little rolls and things on the bass drum. So but when I first met Bill, I remember saying to him, funny to actually meet you now. I've never met you before, but I know a lot about your right foot or left foot, whichever foot it is. I know all about that. I spent ages listening to that. But anyway, after 2 days of doing this, I went downstairs to below where the tape machine is kept and discovered that Tony Arnold had unplugged track one. I plugged it back in again. There was the bass drum. But yes, we did the Great Deceiver, and the bit that for me that was most fascinating, which is Robert, is that it's utterly honest. So I think it's on Providence. When you finally get there to the huge climax, there's stars. It builds up, it builds up, it builds up. It returns to the big theme at the end, and there's a blindingly wonderful Rod Bam Bum note on it.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I know.
And in a funny way, that note is partly why I think the whole thing is successful. It's an example of why it's so successful, because the fact that that note is there subliminally, I think, makes you realize that the whole thing is real.
Mhm.
It hasn't been fixed. It is what it was. So therefore, all the wonderful things, such as the improv, are also as they were. In other words, this hasn't been, we've mixed it, but we haven't altered it in any way. What you are listening to is an honest picture.
Yeah.
So I think I didn't realize then that my career would go in such an odd direction. I remember it might be in a royal package or something. Robert introducing me as an expert in audio necrophilia.
Mhm.
I think that was the phrase he used. Because yes, we then moved on from multi-tracks to the fact that you can, if you try hard enough, you can make some very strange cassettes sound very good if you're willing to spend the time. So, but actually that's partly because the shows are real, and if the shows are real and in the moment, then the recordings are valid, and that's why people like listening to them.
So sort of for me as a young musician who didn't have money to have good gear at all, like still remember, like I used to have a Sony DAT machine that I recorded my first music on, and that was good quality. But then like the first sound cards for my PC sounded horrible, and then I sort of had to. And you know, this really already was in the days when you were already talking about Sadie and using Sadie, I think. So, and then like realizing, okay, there's this free piece of software called Cool Edit Pro or something, and it had a denoiser function, right? So you could actually take a FFT file and kind of like, and it was it sort of became like my mode of working, right? Like I always had to work with badly recorded material, and that sort of was I thought was a really good school kind of like to go through as a musician / producer. And you were sort of like, I mean, I was really like very much into King Crimson back then, and I knew every single note on those records, you know. But
yeah, Sadie was interesting. The audio standard of the early computer software, because actually what we did, there was the very early, what it was called Pro Tools. I think there was the very early Sound Designer. There was the very early Sound Designer, and Sadie came along. And all we did with those, but there were about three or four we looked at, we simply put a piece of audio in and out five or six times. That's what we did. We literally put it into the software, took it out again, put it back in, same thing, put it in. And Sadie's one, you virtually couldn't tell when you A/B'd your 6th generation one to your 1st generation one. You thought, oh, okay, this is pretty faithful. The other ones were horrible, all of them. It's fascinating. When you put I'll listen to number 6 against number 1. You know, number 6 sounded like a modern MP3 or something, but you know, relative to the original. So this was how we decided. So actually, Sadie didn't have the best functionality at the time, but we thought, well, like that sound-wise, that one is streets ahead of all the others. And we carried on with that until was it called Logic? eMag? Yes, it was Logic, wasn't it? Until eMagic's version of Logic. I think it might be Logic 6, or I can't remember which was the very first. Like, it was prior to Apple buying it. It was maybe by eMagic. And Eno recommended that to us. So we carried on using Sadie. And then when we needed a multi-track editing, you know, slightly MIDI-based thing, I think we asked Eno what he was using, and he suggested. And so now I do everything in Logic. So.
Hey, so when King Crimson started in '94, did you guys record on ADAT, or what was the?
Okay, so Vroom. What was Vroom on ADAT is a very good question.
No, I don't think it was. I think that both the recordings certainly Thrak wasn't, because Thrak was recorded at Real World, and I'm fairly sure Vroom. I don't think Vroom was. I think Vroom was recorded on tape. We had the ADATs by then, so we were using the ADATs and all of the other stuff. So all the live stuff was recorded on ADATs. The string quintet was recorded on ADATs. Absent Lovers, The Night Watch, all of those were done off ADAT. But I think the album Vroom was probably done on tape. The only album that's on ADAT is The Construction of the Light.
Yeah. No, I was thinking about the live shows, how you captured the live shows.
Shows are all on ADAT. They used to take out 10 ADATs. They used to have 2 racks of 5. So because they needed to change over because the sets were too long for a 1-hour ADAT tape. So they had 10 ADAT machines, 2 racks of 5. And we haven't revisited them all, we occasionally do, but we've got pretty much all of the shows from 95 through till 2003 recorded on ADAT. That's becoming a mixed blessing, because like all these formats, ironically, early tape is the one format that really has lasted really, really well. You know, you can go back to 1969 and transfer those tapes really easily. If you go back to your early Sony DAT machine that you mentioned a little while ago, I suspect you may find those DATs don't necessarily transfer very well. DAT's been a dodgy format, and ADAT is a sort of a sometimes dodgy format. So, but we've been working on trying to get everything we think is really precious, you know, transferred off onto hard drives now. But yeah.
Hey, so just thinking back, like, so there were at least a couple or more major projects for you every year, right? Starting in the early 90s with like Sylvie and Fripp.
So I did. Yeah. So Sylvie and Fripp followed. When did Sylvie? No, it happened before the string quintet. I think whether it was. Might have even been in the middle of the string quintet. It was because it was 92. So I think actually it might have. I think we might have done frame by frame, begun the string quintet possibly, then done Sylvie and Fripp, and then actually gone back and finished this and done string quintet again. I think it might have happened in the middle of that, because Sylvie and Fripp was my only ever experience of doing major live front of house sound. Was probably Sylvie and Fripp. It's not something that I'd ever done before. I've worked entirely in studios, and I got to know Richard Chadwick, who manages David and managed King Crimson for a while, very well later. And I always told him that I never thanked him for the phone, because he phoned me up and said, "Oh, Robert and David have decided to ask you if you do the sound engineer for the forthcoming tour in Japan." It was the very first one. And I said, "Fine, yes, I'm free and available." And he said, "Well, how much money do you want?" And I had no idea what live sound was worth. Absolutely none. I'd never done it. And being a very cunning guy, he didn't give me any indication whatsoever, but wanted to know then. He said, "Well, I need to know now because I'm trying to do the budget." So I wasn't able to sort of phone a friend and find out, what I should be asking. And we had no, like everybody, early marriage, had absolutely no money. And I can't remember what figure I came up with, but it was so far wrong that he told me later that I was the worst paid person on the tour, and the sound engineer is always the best paid. So I got the number completely wrong, and I pointed this out to Richard later. "You bastard, anyway." But yes, and I can remember doing that, and it was a great challenge. And after about the third show, I remember explaining to Robert, "Yes, this really isn't for me, because now I don't know what I want to do tomorrow." As in, it was wonderful until once I'd done a fantastic show and got it so it sounded the way I really thought it should sound. And here it is, I've done that, I've cracked that. oh, now I've got to make the same record that I made yesterday. I've got to make that same record again tomorrow. You know?
Mhm.
It's a completely different way of thinking about the world. Whereas previously, you know, if you're in records, that's what you do. You made it. And once you made it, you're on to the next one. Whereas, oh, I have to do exactly the same thing tomorrow now, trying to be as good as I was yesterday, which is even less easy. But yeah, I did the Sylvian Fripp, then we did the string quintet, then King Crimson started up, and then we were sort of always juggling two things at the same time, because there were the various projects of the new King Crimson, you know, whether it was, you know, the live albums when we did the Boom in 1995, for example, and also we did started the series of archive series, so effectively worked our way through Epitaph, The Night Watch, Absent Lovers, Room Room. So yeah, so those were very busy years, and in fact it alighted quite successfully, because at the time we didn't control the main King Crimson catalogue. We just had the live material, which was very good, because it meant we focused probably more than you normally would have done, I suppose, on the live material, which is and then in the early 2000s, the license from the main catalogue had been licensed to Virgin Records, and that license expired. And just to show how the mainstream industry it never occurred to them we wouldn't renew it, interestingly.
Mhm.
But when they did a license, I think to them they were the major labels, I suppose, were the only game in town. And had we wanted to be in with a major label, we would, in fairness, have stayed where we were. It was perfectly fine. But when they did a 10-year license, it never occurred to them that, you know, anybody would say, well, thank you, now we'll have it back now, thank you. So we got the main catalogue back, and that's therefore enabled us to go through doing these box sets, because to do those you obviously have to control the main studio albums. So then that we started on the next lease of life, which was going through doing the box sets, and we're doing Exposure this year. I think that's a secret that's already out there. Hopefully, if it is anyway, but we're doing Exposure this year, which is wonderful. And I think we have a plan for next year, but we're almost at the end of those, which is actually, I find all these things exciting. I don't find, it doesn't worry me. You know, occasionally Alex, Mr. Stormy Monday, you know, phones me up, I think slightly worried about, David, aren't we getting near the end of this, whatever thing we're doing? And I said to him, well, Alex, if you look at the history of the last 20 years, the end of this is always the beginning of something else. So let's, you know,
Yeah.
I think I've learned now not to be worried about the fact, you know, to be excited rather than worried about the fact that we're getting to the end of this. So I think you know, when we do get to the end of the box sets, that'll free up a huge amount of time, because they take about 6 months of the year to put those box sets together. Yeah.
Hey, so let me jump back a little to Thrack Attack.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it's probably wrong to say this, but I think that the compilation of those improvs sort of opened the doors for the project somehow. At least, you know, to somebody who was listening from the outside, you know, having heard Thrack Attack, the projects were really not a shock at all.
Well, it changed the way the band played, and it sounds terrible. Looking back, there are times when I can't remember which of Robert and I thought of something. Hopefully because we're in step with each other, so probably we both thought of it both at the same time. But I do remember coming back off a tour, and the idea being, because, you know, they used to play that short, it was only about 3.5 minutes, the improvisation in the middle of Thrack. Well, what would an hour of that sound like? And I know that my idea of what that meant was different to Robert, but we had this thing, well, I wonder, what would an hour of that sound like? And then basically I set about compiling it. And while I was doing it, I remember Robert had a friend visiting who came in and listened, and Robert, I must have explained, well, David's trying to find bits from all over the place and put them together so they make sense. And the person asked him, well, how does David know what to do? And Robert said, because he has perfect taste. And I always remembered that, because I thought at the time, that's how precarious the life of a record producer is. Because what Robert I don't know if it is what Robert meant, but one interpretation of what Robert said was that my taste coincides with Robert's taste.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
In other words, my taste is perfect. It will be, but because it is purely down to where the muse takes you. And it was more interesting, in fact, when I did Attack Thrack, which was the repeat, which was the revenge of Thrack Attack, which we did for the box set. Because having done it once, I knew how to do it, even though at the time it was difficult to believe it was going to happen again. Because all you can do with those improvisations is you listen to them all and you learn them. Mm-hmm. That's what you do. Effectively, you listen to them all. Sometimes I write tiny bits of scores. A lot of them I didn't actually write scores. I sort of gave them names. So I sort of had so I sort of got to know the texture of each of them. And that's that when he goes like that. There's that when he goes like that. There's that when he goes like that. And while you're doing that, you still have no idea how you're going to do this. And then there is a wonderful moment when it really becomes composition, just like any other composition. Begin, and then you get to the final note, and you sort of, oh, well, the next note is this note, which is that piece of music that comes over here. And somehow the music is now inside you enough that you just slot them together. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I created them I changed the 3-minute bits into bits of about 10 minutes. And at the time, I imagined that there would then be gaps. So I saw this thing as being a series of 10-minute pieces, which is what I very first created. And Robert's idea was that it should be absolutely continuous. That was definitely came from Robert. So I then went back and worked out how I could then join these 10-minute pieces into a continuous piece. And in fact, when I did it on Attack Thrack, I did it the other way around. And actually I made them because I put the main Thrack theme back again. So on Attack Thrack, they remain sort of 10-minute pieces. Instead of continuing, it goes back into the main theme and then continues on into another improvisation. So we created these pieces, and the most noticeable way that it changed the real world was that I noticed that in 1996, when the band went back out again, the improvisations in Thrack were much longer. Mm-hmm. So effectively, they'd listened to the longer form versions and thought, hey, these things don't have to be 3 minutes anymore. We can now do this. So you're right, there is inevitably a feedback loop between what you do and then what the band hear and how they play it next time. So yes, and I think the projects remain some of the most exciting music we've ever worked on. I'm not all of it, I mean, there are moments, I'm sure, but as an overall thing, I think the work of the projects is one of the sort of undiscovered secrets. I think they're fabulous. But
I agree. And I spoke with Trey the other day, and we then realized that it was only like maybe not even a 2-year period, right? For the projects.
No, I think they went to 98, so it would have been 97 and 98, I would think. Because 1999, they started the double duo, I think. So I think it was probably just those 2 years, 97 and 98.
Yeah.
And some of them had remarkably few. So Project 4, I think, only played 7 gigs or something.
Yeah.
One did just 4 nights at Jazz Cafe. Project 4 did about 7 nights. Project 2 obviously gigged a lot. That was the one that did way the most gigs. And in fact, Project 3 didn't do that many. So it's, but you listen back to it, and there's some absolutely fabulous stuff.
Yeah.
And it comes back great thing about being in the moment. Somehow, when music is created, it remains present forever. Somehow, there's when you listen to, when you listen to a recording that actually captures, the moment of creation in flight or whatever it is, it somehow you can hear that in the recordings.
Yeah.
That's
So, in how far were you involved in how did it come about? Do you still remember? Was it?
I wasn't involved at that stage. I sensibly was as far away from the management of King Crimson as you could possibly be. Only an idiot would want to manage a band. Trust me. I think it's come around. I wasn't even in the frame for it then, but it's come around. It came around about twice more, and both times I ducked as fast as I could possibly duck. So no, the projects was Robert's baby to go and do. So in terms of the recordings and preparing them and the various releases, I'm very happy sitting in the studio doing that, which is what I did. So at the time it was fine. I stayed at home. I carried on working in the studio. The band went away and toured like crazy, producing lots of wonderful music, and I helped to make recordings of it. This was a very sensible existence.
So you were you at the Jazz Cafe for Project One?
Yes, in fact, I did the front of house for Jazz Cafe because it was in. So yeah, I did the front of house for that.
Yeah. I was there for 2 nights.
Right.
That show.
And that was interesting because they refused to rehearse together, to sound check together. They wanted it to be genuinely brand new. So when I did a sound check, I did everybody individually, but they never played a note together. The very first note they played together was the first note of of this first show. So.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. And so fast forward like 14 years or something to the new King Crimson.
Oh yeah.
Where you were not the manager at the beginning of that, right?
No. So I was around. No, I mean, I wasn't. I mean, I think I knew it was coming, and the ideas were around. So obviously, I was around talking to Robert when it was floating in the ether. It partly came about as a result of the band that John Wetton was going to put together. So Robert had, if you remember, Robert had given up live performance at the time because he felt it was impossible in the current commercial climate. So Robert wasn't playing live. I went to Japan and I gave a gold disc to Steve Hackett. And I remember thinking, hold on, Steve Hackett's now getting gold discs playing Genesis, basically. It was his Genesis Revisited series. And I came back and suggested to Robert that if he wasn't going to play live, we should find a band that would, in the same way that Steve Hackett was doing, a legitimate band that would keep the music of King Crimson alive. And so we had a meeting at DGM with John Wetton, Mel Collins, Jacko. I don't know who was going to. I don't know if Gavin was going to drum. I don't know. I'm trying to think. But anyway, we spoke to John, but certainly it would have been Jacko, Mel, John, about putting together a band that I think John was keen to call it Crimson DNA. I think. So that band was discussed. And we started discussing set lists. Interestingly, I remember sitting and saying, "Well, John, we need to do this, and you should be playing Starless, and you're playing, whatever, all these pieces." And the following day, Robert came back in the kitchen and said to me, "Would David, I fancy playing some of that material." It wasn't that instant, but interestingly, I'm sure in a way that was a seed, because obviously when the new band did arrive. That was the way it went. It reinvented the old material. So John's band, John's the band with John didn't happen, but in fact, you know, a different band, but without John, sort of morphed into the band in 2014. And no, originally it was managed by Andy Leff, and I think Andy was the right person to get it together. He managed Porcupine Tree, so he had an existing crew, and Robert had a relationship with Andy because he'd done soundscapes with them. And the problem is that Andy isn't a details person, really, and there's a point at which King Crimson becomes very much a details operation. And so it sort of began to fall apart, sadly, partly over money, because actually I was just sitting looking at it from Robert's point of view, because I managed Robert's financial affairs, and Robert kept not being paid for all his money from the first tour, and it was all to do with some form of some problem in the way they they filed the taxes in America, and it became apparent that Andy wasn't going to be the person who was going to be able to sort those issues out, and I went up to see Robert, suggesting, not realizing, I'm thinking, well, obviously he just needs to talk to Andy and get Andy to find some way of solving this, and came up to Robert and said, look, there's this issue with this money, you need to talk to Andy and get someone to sort it out. And Robert basically phoned up Andy, and rather than the conversation I'd imagined he had with Andy, basically, I think while I was there, Robert phoned up Andy and said, dear Andy, obviously not working out, so you're not the manager, King Crimson, David is. You may notice I didn't have time to duck in that conversation. That's sort of how it happened. And you still do have to be mad. I would define myself as lots of things, but one thing I won't define myself is as a manager. It's because a manager is really it's not really a creative role. Not creative in the way I would like it to be creative anyway, as in artistically creative. It's really purely it's a cross between an accountant and a social worker. That's what you are. You're a manager. You're an accountant, social worker,
but also a problem solver, right?
Solver, and it's a mixture of all those things. But so basically you deal with a lot of stuff all the time, not creative stuff, just stuff. But I'm sure from the band's point of view, I think it was the right call, because I seem to have managed okay, and I'm happy to have done it because it's kept the band going, and this is the longest lasting incarnation of King Crimson ever. So so it was a role I was able to fulfill, and I'm happy to fulfill it, but I still have no desire to be a manager, which is possibly why I make a good manager. I shouldn't say I'm a good manager. It's not my job to say that. If I am a good manager, it's because I don't want to be one. There we are. That's but yes, it's been interesting, and getting back full circle to where the conversation started with lockdown. You then have a band, with as with a lot of musicians, with a whole year with no income. We have a touring partnership. There's a King Crimson partnership whose only income, I mean, the band have other income from elsewhere, but that partnership only earns income from touring. And suddenly you have a year in which you have costs because you've been paying out on the assumption that a tour is going to happen.
Yeah.
So you're paying out money, and suddenly there is zero income. And when we file the accounts for that year, there will be absolutely no income. And no income from the government, because governments don't seem to want to support artists. That doesn't seem to. And that's not a sob, because actually, as I told all the members of the band early on, I think we're very privileged in that it's something we can cope with. 2 years would be very difficult from the partnership's point of view if we had a second. But actually, I said, this is actually, I think we mostly have to think, no, we're compared to a ton of people in the world, we're really very lucky because yes, okay, I can put a plan together that has zero income this year, and provided we are able to tour, well, this year as it now is coming up, provided we're able to tour in this year, over the 2-year period, we will come out, we will come out fine. We won't make as much money as we would have made, but that's not the issue. We will be fine. So, but it is amazing the amount of work you have to do not to do anything, as in, to arrange to postpone a tour and argue with insurance companies who would like to tell you that not only are they not going to pay out on the insurance, because we pay huge amounts of money, I mean, probably at least $100,000 a year to insure tours. And the insurance company would then like to tell you that they would like your money for the tour of last year, but they will not like to pay out because they would like to say that there was an exemption they didn't tell you about at the time. So they don't want to pay out on COVID because it was an act of God. But on the other hand, they do want us to pay the $100,000 fee for a tour that never happened. It's like, after much persuasion and arm twisting, they did agree with me that I said, well, actually, as we've postponed the tour, I will pay you your $100,000 fee, but it has to apply to this year, as in the one that's about to happen, because it's really the same tour. You just moved the tour from last year to this year. But that is the stupidity. There is weeks of my life in that simple sentence there. There is weeks of my life arguing with insurance companies who are trying desperately to screw you over and to achieve nothing. Really, that's the problem. Yes, so you do a lot of work to stay still, but hopefully we will be. I think July the 23rd. We will be playing gigs in the US on July the 23rd, which seemed, well, when we first moved it last year, we thought, well, that was definitely going to be okay because we left the whole year forward. We thought, oh, well, that's bound to be okay, middle of 2021. How can that not be perfect? Earlier this year, we were twitching and thinking, oh God, is July going to be all right? Right now, it looks better than it has done, I think, hopefully, but we still don't know.
Yeah. So I have so the problem solving that you're doing in management, right?
Yeah.
And like compared with the problem solving you did in Tony Arnold's studio, like replacing that kick drum, right? Do you think that there's any like what is your what have you learned over the years, and what are your strategies to solve these complex, detailed problems?
My only strategy is that I believe in being transparent and fair.
Mm-hmm.
That is my strategy. And it's surprising how often you're advised not to do that, because quite rightly, a load of people will tell you that it will be perceived as a weakness.
Mm-hmm.
But particularly if you're dealing with hard-nosed people, because I'm not trying. So you either go in and you hide, you keep your information close to your chest, and you lob in some great big demand, expecting it to be chipped down to something that you might have wanted to settle for in the first place. You can play that game. Generally, I don't like to do that. I tend to think I will be transparent and I will be fair. I think the Guitarcraft model is probably assume the virtue. As in, I will approach this like this, and I will challenge you to try and, hopefully, I would say rise to our level, but act accordingly. So usually I try to do that, and it, there are genuine disagreements over things with people, and it's not always very easy, but mostly that has worked very well. And actually Robert is helpful because he often chips in pointing that out when people don't see it. As in David was one of the fairest people I know. So if he thinks, if he is probably trying to offer you what is a fair deal, not just from our point of view, but for both of us. So I tend to try and come in and say, okay, this is what I think is the fair solution. And there is a danger, because some people will regard that as being your starting bid and think, hey, great, we can now chip him down further. And then you have to say, no, I'm not playing that game. I've told you, this is the beginning and the end. We've thought about this really hard. We think that's fair. And the other strategy is actually that at university, I studied philosophy, and logic remains a very good tool for any of these sort of disputes, because quite regularly what people are saying is illogical. And if you can reduce it to a very, very simple argument, then it's obvious, as in, this happened, you said this, you said we agreed this, we agreed with it, so therefore this. And what you're saying can't be right. These points are indisputable. So the answer has to be the next one. You can't. So if you can reduce something and cut all the huge distractions, you can actually just get it down to 3 or 4 key points. So key points 1, 2, 3, 4, then 5. Those probably are. There you are. So. Try and reduce things to very simple, clear arguments, and be transparent and fair would be the completely balmy David Singleton guide to management. I think Peter Grant had an entirely alternative system. He probably made more money than I did, by the way.
I was going to ask where you find the motivation to actually fight those, or to live through those arguments, but I think you gave the answer. It's your interest in playing. Well, you are sort of also playing a game, but on the level of reducing, as you say, the logic to the core.
There are times when the motivation is the toughest part, because it isn't naturally what I would regard myself as doing.
Mm-hmm.
If you go back, I'm here for music, not for business. Bluntly, if you want to simplify it, I'm here for music, not for business. And obviously, if you're in management, you're in business, really. And so, so a lot of the time, I am therefore doing something that, when I get out of bed, I don't leap out of bed and think, "Hey, today's a great day for having a dispute," or whatever. But it's the stuff that needs doing. I undertook to do the job, and yes, so you then just do it to the best of your ability. I think, it's what comes with it, and I do like to try.
So would you say that it's an outlet for your creativity at this point in your life?
I don't know. Maybe I wonder if, in retrospect, I will decide it was. Several people have said to me that they think it is. I don't see it like that yet. I think it may have been Jack, or several members of the band have said, "You're wrong. What you're doing is perfectly creative. It's just, creative in a way that maybe I don't see it as being."
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. So maybe I will look back in later years and think, "Oh, well, actually, no, that was quite a creative period." If nothing else, I don't know if you know them, but I write the Vicar Chronicles, which are sort of semi-fictional whodunits based in the music industry. And if nothing else, on a really depressing day, I can always amuse myself with, "Well, that's another very good story for the vicar." So yeah.
Hey, so is there going to be a songbook too?
There is, and oddly enough, the Jeremy Stacey, God bless him, seems to have taken on the role of being my pointed stick, because that's what the price you pay for King Crimson management is that you don't make songbook number 2. Mm-hmm. But put bluntly, there's only so much time in a day, and I'm continuing doing most of the production role I was doing. So songbook number 2 has been the thing that has borne the brunt. And Jeremy, God bless him, was obviously a fan of the Vicar, and he phones me up almost, well, not daily, but certainly weekly or monthly, to say, "David, where is songbook number 2? And you promised to send me a song, and you haven't sent me one yet. And where is it? I want to hear it." And oddly enough, I sent him one today. I keep on not doing that, and I got so embarrassed today that I thought, well, I'll send him one of the demos I've been working on. So I sent him a quick demo earlier on today, and he phoned me back very sweetly and said, "Well, this is wonderful." He said, you shouldn't be working on King Crimson. This is what you should be doing." So there's a man trying to talk his manager out of managing him, which is wonderful. So God bless Jeremy, I say. But yes, there will be a songbook number 2, and there are oodles of songs for it. The songwriting is easy. The songwriting is what I do. The arranging takes time, and then finding people to sing them takes time. But the songwriting is a pleasure and a joy, and yeah. So there will be a songbook number 2.
Wonderful. Hey, so the songwriting and the arrangement is 2 completely different things for you?
Yes, and in fact, in some cases they're separated by 20 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot of songs that I wrote late 20s, early 30s, I think probably, that I knew at the time were, I think, all artists have to be egotistical. So I think they're wonderful songs. They're fantastic songs. There were songs I hugely believed in, but I couldn't work out what to do with them. I couldn't work out how to arrange them or how to present them to the world. The short of a sort of, I've never particularly liked, strummed acoustic guitar songs when, it's obvious that's not what they should be. It's fine as a sort of an unplugged something, but I listened and thought, well, that's not what the song should be, or even me playing it on the piano. And I had a lot of friends at college, in fact, who used to say, "Dave, we used to think you were a great songwriter, but we had no idea what to do with your songs." And in a bizarre world, the correct person to arrange those songs was me 20 or 30 years later.
Mm-hmm.
By which time I had sort of the musical chops to realize, no, I now know how to arrange those songs. And ironically, I don't know if I'd write the songs as well now, because there's an innocence and a wonder in the writing of the songs. So actually, I love some of the stuff that that strange young man wrote then. But now I can arrange. Now I can do them justice and arrange. And they get rewritten. So I think so although they are new, but I take the genesis of the song then and tweak it and make it into what it should be now. I always think I always make the joke about a song. It's the same as the joke about the broom, that there's no such thing as a bad song. There's just a bad lyric, a bad melody, and a bad arrangement, or a bad harmony, or whatever. And all you have to do, so if you don't like one, you alter it, and then you've got and then it's a good song. A bit like my broom's brand new. It's just I've changed the handle 5 times and the bottom 10 times. So there's no such thing as a bad song. You just have to change all the bits that are bad.
Yeah, I agree. And how do songs come to you? In which form? Is there like one way, or are there many?
The melody and the lyric nearly always come together, although I may well then tweak the lyric, or the melody, in fact. But I tend to come up with a melody and lyric together, and whether the harmony comes first or afterwards, it's a bit of both. Sometimes you'll be on a piano or a guitar, and you'll find a wonderful chord structure, and the harmony will suggest the lyric, the melody to you. Mm-hmm. But equally well, other times I'll hear a melody in my head, and then I've got to go and harmonize it. So happens a bit of both. I have written a few pieces that are not, that are purely instrumental, but mostly I just love writing. I love a perfectly turned song. I'm a huge fan of the craft of, songwriting. You could talk to me for hours about that. I'll do it.
This is kind of like the stuff that I find very interesting. It's like how do you do the things you do? That's really I have to say, like my main interest is even in other people, in experts, right? Like say, like you're an expert for, you know,
Yeah.
audio restoration or finding takes that, you know, so that you can repair something and blah blah blah. And so now this idea of like you as a songwriter and like a melody and a lyric kind of like appearing at the same time. What I'm sometimes wondering, or what I would be interesting to me, is like, do you think that your subconscious is kind of like working these things out, and at some point they kind of like come to the surface, or is there really something there that sort of like simply appears out of thin air?
My sense of them, well, it's a bit of both. The beginning of a song is my sense is it comes out of thin air. That doesn't mean that my subconscious, I suppose, hasn't been preparing something with my subconscious. I didn't know. But you will, I'm not going to now, another day I might, but I literally sit there at a piano or something and I play something, I think, there it is, there it is. Then there is a point where it becomes work, pleasurable work, but it always happens in two stages pretty much. There's the initial bit, however long the initial bit is. Here is a melody. Here's the first half of a melody. Here's the opening line of something. And then there's the bit which is the craft of the songwriter, really, I think, which is here's the answering phrase, or here's the perfect middle eight, and this is where it should go. And I think also, you've written a lyric for a first verse. Here's the second verse, because there are so many songs really, when you listen to them, and actually the second verse really is just the same as the first verse, as in it's the same idea. I'm just tumbling over a few, and sometimes that works very well, and sometimes you think, well, it's it couldn't be that. So there's an initial thing that appears from somewhere, and then there is craft. I think then it's a thing you do, and you have to wait on it sometimes. I mean, I'm a very patient songwriter. I don't demand, having done the first bit, it's off. If I go somewhere else, it's possible that the middle bit that I then wrote would be quite hackneyed. If I just sort of said, oh, I need another middle bit. Well, okay, Paul McCartney might have done this, or John Lennon might have done, somebody, I don't know, however you think about it. You have to go, you sort of, once you've got the first bit, you then have to wait until the moment when you effectively have a fresh inspiration, and then the perfect second bit presents itself. This is if you want to do this again, I'll do it as a separate conversation, because I will sit around and set myself up so I can play you something, because that's actually what you need to do. But anyway, it's because then it's very obvious.
Yes, like the question would be like, if you have like your initial idea, whatever that idea is, and then I like, does everything else in the song like come or follow that initial idea, or would you even have like separate ideas that merge? Like
generally, I've always, I can't think of a single example. There probably is one somewhere, but right now I can't think of an example where I've simply, merged two ideas. And the particular craft of songwriting that I like dislikes that. So although I enjoy a lot of 10cc, in terms of songwriters, I would argue I find them they often do that for me, as in, here's a bit and now here's another bit, but actually the two bits don't really belong. They work fine, but you've got bit A and bit B is just followed it, bit C just followed it. It's a very different style of songwriting. I think, by the way, I think they're probably the best people at doing that. But I think that's what I hear in a lot of 10cc songs. Whereas I like to make it so that it did organically. This really did follow this, as opposed to Oh, I know. Probably the only example in Beatles land I can think of, A Day in the Life. A Day in the Life, the middle bit and the first bit are put together. They don't belong, well, they belong together because they put them together actually, but that is not a single songwriting moment that went from, you know, the glorious John Lennon bit to then woke up, you know, got out, whatever it is, got out of bed in the middle. But actually that's probably the only Beatles song where I can think of that I quickly off the top of my head that I do think that's true of, where I can hear a, you know, a completely different disconnect between the first part and the second part. Although they may well have, you know, so the rest of them, the two of them gelled so well that it does feel to me like a single cohesive idea.
Yeah, you know, the one of the reasons why I asked this question at this point is because I think we should sort of like wrap it up, and what, you know, what would be better than kind of like returning to the beginning with the Bach piece where like one note leads to the other, right? And
yes,
and it didn't surprise me. Your answer didn't surprise me. Also, like knowing your music, it never sounded to me like it was something that was, you know, it always sounded like to me like this, you know, you start somewhere and you arrive somewhere. It's like this process music in a way, but very thoughtfully arranged, as you say, but it still sounds like process music to me, you know.
No, I don't, yeah. And you're right. That's probably why, I'm sure there's a reason why the prelude struck me, because it's one of those effortless, it's one of the most effortless things I've ever played. It literally is, every note follows the previous one as if it, you know.
But you know, it's true. I would say it's true for every thing that Bach ever did. Like I use or utilize Bach's music for my music theory teaching. And it's so fascinating to me. Like I can really get so excited about like analyzing Bach in front of people, you know. Like it's the most genius thing ever, and you don't even need to hear it, right? You don't even have to have a sense of sound, and you can enjoy what he's doing.
So anyway, so I'm always here. That's wonderful, and
pleasure yes. to talking to you. I mean, I think this is the longest we've ever talked to each other.
And I said, so maybe it's another. See, it's, if you go back to where we started, it's fascinating how, for all of the, you know, the horribleness of lockdown, things have also happened. You presumably wouldn't have been doing blogs. You know, it's funny how, yes, it's opened. We don't yet like them, and probably the windows or the doors it's opened are not those we'd have liked. But it has opened doors as well as closed them.
Yeah, it certainly has, and I'm actually very. I don't want to say I'm excited, but I'm really curious what's gonna come next. And I think it has sort of created this quite forcefully the need for change. And yeah, I think, I mean, for me the timing couldn't be better. My daughter was born on 1st of October 2019, so wow. I spent like almost every single second of her life with her. Right.
That's astonishing. Actually, I little bits of advice I can give you, because I didn't. I said if I go back to what I told you, you know, the first, what have been 4 years of my eldest son's life, I was, you know, going to work on an aeroplane. Almost broke my heart, actually. I didn't know this at the time, but Inde told me much later that when he was 3 or 4 and he, you know, was playing in the garden and saw airplanes going overhead, he used to say, "Oh, look, there's Daddy going to work."
Oh, wow.
Which was not something I liked, you know. So I hadn't realized it was like that, as much like that as, you know, that was his impression of it. So so yes, there's a blessing, because those you don't get those days back again.
Yes. Yeah. And I've been trying to get my bookkeeping in order, and I thought, okay, like now I have 3 months to do it, and even after a year, it's not not in order.
No, very good. No, so wonderful to talk to you, and
Yeah.
let me know what you're doing with it, and I'll put something up about it.
I will. Thank you very much, David.
Okay, good talk to you.
Yeah, say hi to your family.
I will. Bye.
Bye bye.